There is an island in the Caribbean where you can walk from France to the Netherlands in 20 minutes. No passport control, no border fence, no armed guards checking documents. Just a white monument on a beach and two completely different worlds existing side by side. This is Sint Maarten/Saint Martin, the smallest landmass on Earth divided between two sovereign nations. 37 square miles, two governments, two currencies, two languages, two legal systems, one island. How did this happen? And more importantly, why has it worked for over 375 years when borders everywhere else seem to tear communities apart, when nationalism drives walls higher and rhetoric harder? The answer lies in salt slavery, strategic pragmatism, and a very unusual treaty signed in 1648 that nobody expected to last. But this isn't just a story about lines on a map or colonial compromise. It's about what happens when geography forces cooperation, when isolation creates unexpected identity, and when two colonial powers realize that sometimes sharing is infinitely more profitable than fighting. Stand on the border monument today and you'll see something remarkable, something almost unthinkable in our current age of hardened frontiers. No guards, no walls, no tension, no security apparatus. Just tourists taking selfies with one foot in each country, children playing across invisible lines, and locals who cross this international border multiple times daily without even thinking about it. To understand why this island chose coexistence over conflict, why it became an exception to almost every rule about borders and sovereignty, we need to go back to the moment Europeans first saw these shores. When this tiny dot in the Caribbean became unexpectedly valuable, and when two empires decided that 37 square miles was simply too small, too remote, and too difficult to keep fighting over. Sint Maarten sits exactly where the Caribbean curves into the Atlantic, positioned at a geographic crossroads that has defined its entire history. It's part of the Leeward Islands, that chain of volcanic peaks, and coral formations stretching from Puerto Rico down to Venezuela, each island a different story of tectonic collision and human ambition. From space, Sint Maarten looks unremarkable, just another green speck in an endless ocean of blue, indistinguishable from dozens of other Caribbean islands. But zoom in and the geography tells you everything you need to know about why this place matters. The island is roughly oval-shaped, with a mountainous spine running east to west like a geological backbone. The highest point, Pic Paratus, reaches just 1,391 feet above sea level, but that's enough to create two distinct climate zones, two different ecosystems, two separate developmental possibilities. The Dutch south is flatter, drier, dominated by salt ponds and long sandy beaches perfect for tourism and salt production. The French north is greener, hillier, with more annual rainfall and steeper, more dramatic coastlines that feel almost Mediterranean. Between them, a border that runs diagonally across the island, cutting it almost perfectly in half with surprising precision. 16 square miles for the French. 21 for the Dutch. The Caribbean Sea laps against beaches on both sides with the same turquoise water. Hurricane winds sweep through every fall with devastating impartiality. And underneath it all, limestone and volcanic rock, the bones of an island born from tectonic collision millions of years ago. This geography, these subtle differences in terrain and rainfall, would determine everything that followed. Who could farm what crops? Who controlled the valuable salt deposits, who had the best natural harbors for trade and defense. Christopher Columbus spotted the island on November 11, 1493, during his second voyage to the New World when European exploration was reshaping global maps and destinies. He named it after Saint Martin of Tours, whose feast day coincidentally fell on the day of discovery, a saint known for sharing his cloak with a beggar, an ironic foreshadowing of the island's future. But Columbus didn't stop. He saw no gold glinting in the hills, no obvious resources, no indigenous cities worth plundering. Just another island in a sea of islands that all looked similar from the deck of a Spanish ship. For decades, European powers ignored Sint Maarten completely, dismissing it as too small, too remote, too unimportant for colonization. Then came the salt. The Dutch, masters of maritime trade and preservation techniques, discovered that the island's southern salt ponds produced exceptionally high-quality sea salt, essential for preserving meat and fish on long ocean voyages before refrigeration. Suddenly, this tiny, previously ignored island mattered enormously. The Spanish claimed it first, recognizing its strategic value, building Fort Amsterdam in 1631 to control access. The Dutch attacked immediately and took control in 1633, viewing the salt as critical infrastructure. The Spanish reconquered it in 1644, killing or enslaving the Dutch defenders in a brutal counterattack that left the island depopulated and devastated. Then, in 1648, something completely unexpected happened that would change everything. The Spanish, overextended across their massive global empire and facing rebellions everywhere, abandoned the island entirely, deciding it simply wasn't worth defending anymore. The Dutch returned immediately, reclaiming their salt operations. But so did the French, who had been quietly using the island's northern resources during Spanish occupation. Both nations had legitimate claims based on prior settlement. Both wanted the salt and harbors. Both had the military capacity to take the island by force. War seemed absolutely inevitable. Instead, they did something remarkable. They talked. The Treaty of Concordia was signed on March 23, 1648, in a simple ceremony that created one of history's most unusual borders. The agreement was straightforward. Divide the island peacefully, share resources fairly, and cooperate against external threats, particularly the Spanish and British who might try to retake it. Legend says they decided the border through a walking race, one Dutchman and one Frenchman starting back-to-back at a point on the coast, walking the perimeter in opposite directions until they met on the other side. Where they met would determine each nation's territory. The story claims the Frenchman walked faster because he drank wine, while the Dutchman, slowed by gin, covered less distance. It's a charming tale, repeated endlessly in tourist brochures and island histories. It's also almost certainly complete fiction. The real division was far more pragmatic, methodical, and strategic than any drinking race. The French got slightly less total land but secured better natural harbors on the Atlantic side, crucial for trade with their other Caribbean colonies. The Dutch got the precious salt ponds and calmer Caribbean beaches, perfect for their commercial interests. Both sides could trade freely across the border without tariffs. Both could recruit from each other's population for defense. Both could profit from the same resource base without bearing the enormous cost of constant warfare. It was colonialism with a handshake, empire building with compromise, a recognition that cooperation might actually be more profitable than conquest. The Treaty of Concordia worked because geography made fighting genuinely impractical. The island was too small to sustain two separate military garrisons in permanent conflict without bankrupting both colonies. Supply lines from Europe were too long, too expensive, too vulnerable to pirates and storms. And both nations faced much bigger enemies, the Spanish Empire seeking revenge, the British expanding aggressively throughout the Caribbean, and pirates who would happily take the entire island if the Dutch and French weakened each other through pointless fighting. So they chose coexistence, but let's be absolutely clear about what that meant in practice. The border was never precisely marked with surveyors' instruments or legal exactitude. No fences were built, no checkpoints established, no customs houses. Just a general understanding, documented in vague language, that changed slightly over the decades as French and Dutch communities expanded into previously uninhabited areas. For centuries, the border existed more in administrative documents stored in Amsterdam and Paris than in any physical reality on the ground. Locals crossed freely dozens of times daily. Families intermarried across the line. Languages blended into unique local dialects. The island developed a genuinely unique culture. European colonial administration with Caribbean soul, rigid legal structures with practical flexibility that made daily life possible. But this cooperation, this famous harmony, was built entirely on unimaginable brutality that modern tourism marketing carefully ignores. Both the French and Dutch economies on St. Martin relied completely and absolutely on enslaved Africans, human beings treated as property, worked to death in sugar, salt, and cotton plantations that covered virtually every arable acre. Enslaved people outnumbered Europeans 10-1 by the 1700s, creating a demographic reality that terrified colonial administrators who lived in constant fear of rebellion. The border meant absolutely nothing to enslaved people except different masters with equally cruel, equally dehumanizing systems. When slavery was finally abolished, first by the French in 1848, following the revolution in Paris, then by the Dutch in 1863 after decades of moral pressure and economic calculation, the island's entire economy collapsed almost overnight. Plantations failed without free labor. Population dropped dramatically, as freed people migrated elsewhere seeking better opportunities. For nearly a century, from roughly 1870 to 1950, Sint Maarten became a genuine backwater, too small for industrial development, too remote for major shipping routes, too poor to matter. The border persisted because neither government wanted to formally abandon their claim, but it barely mattered practically. Few people lived here. Even fewer cared about European divisions that seemed increasingly absurd in the post-colonial 20th century. Then came World War II, and suddenly the Caribbean mattered again in ways it hadn't since the Age of Sail. German U-boats prowled these waters, sinking Allied merchant ships and threatening vital supply lines. The United States built military bases throughout the region, transforming quiet islands into strategic assets overnight. And after the war ended, as Europe rebuilt from devastation and decolonization movements swept the globe from Asia to Africa to the Caribbean, Sint Maarten faced an existential choice about its future. Independence seemed almost laughably impractical for such a small population. Barely 10,000 people total, with no natural resources, no industrial base, no military capacity. Instead, both sides made the pragmatic decision to deepen their ties with their respective colonial powers rather than break free. The Dutch half became part of the Netherlands Antilles, a Caribbean federation with limited autonomy. The French side became an official commune of Guadeloupe, fully integrated into the French Republic. These were very different constitutional arrangements with profoundly different implications. Different relationships with Europe, different legal codes, different citizenship rights, different currencies and economic policies. But still, remarkably, astonishingly, no hard border between them. No militarization of the divide. No walls or fences or guard towers. The modern transformation that made Sint Maarten globally famous began with a single strategic decision in the 1950s that nobody fully appreciated at the time: tourism. Prinses Juliana International Airport had opened on the Dutch side in 1943 as a military airstrip, built hastily by the United States to patrol for submarines. After the war, local leaders convinced the Dutch government to convert it for civilian use, recognizing that the island's future lay not in salt or sugar, but in sun, sand, and service industries. The first commercial flights arrived in the late 1950s, small propeller planes from Puerto Rico carrying adventurous travelers. The first cruise ships followed in the 1960s, luxury liners seeking exotic ports that could handle large passenger volumes. Within 2 decades, Sint Maarten went from forgotten colonial outpost to Caribbean paradise destination, its economy completely transforming in ways that nobody had predicted. And remarkably, the border became an attraction rather than an obstacle, a unique selling point that savvy marketers exploited brilliantly. Tourists absolutely loved it. One island, 2 countries, 2 distinct cultures, 2 different cuisines, 2 separate shopping experiences. You could have authentic French wine and cheese for lunch on the northern side. Then Dutch colonial architecture and duty-free electronics shopping in the south for dinner. Spend euros in the gourmet restaurants of Grand Case, then switch to dollars in the casinos of Philipsburg. Visit a traditional French patisserie serving croissants and espresso. Then walk to a Dutch colonial fort with Caribbean views, all without crossing international waters or showing your passport even once. The governments, both Dutch and French, quickly realized the border was actually a powerful marketing tool rather than an administrative burden. Instead of working to erase it or minimize it for efficiency, they deliberately emphasized it, celebrated it, made it central to the island's identity. The friendly island, they called it in every promotional campaign. The Dutch side consciously developed massive resort complexes, flashy casinos, aggressive duty-free shopping centers targeting cruise ship passengers. The French side deliberately cultivated a more sophisticated image with gourmet restaurants, boutique hotels, and quieter beaches appealing to European tastes. Completely different economic strategies, different target demographics, different development philosophies. Same island, same ecosystem, same infrastructure challenges. And remarkably, it worked better than anyone imagined. Tourism exploded exponentially. By the 1990s, over 1 million visitors arrived annually, more than 100 tourists for every permanent resident. Today, it's approaching 2 million annual visitors, creating an economy almost entirely dependent on service industries. The entire economy thrives specifically on this unusual dual identity, this split personality that makes Sint Maarten unlike anywhere else on Earth. Then came Hurricane Irma, and everything changed in ways that revealed the border's true nature. September 6, 2017. Category 5. The most powerful Atlantic hurricane ever recorded at the time, a meteorological monster. Irma SI passed directly over St. Martin with sustained winds exceeding 185 miles per hour and gusts approaching 220, velocities that turned buildings into projectiles. 95% of structures on the island were damaged or completely destroyed in a matter of hours. Entire neighborhoods simply vanished, reduced to concrete foundations and scattered debris. The airport was devastated, its infrastructure shredded. Boats weighing tons were thrown inland like children's toys. Trees were stripped bare or ripped from the ground. The border monument at Oyster Pond was damaged. And the border itself? It disappeared completely under rubble, debris, and shared catastrophe. For weeks after Irma, there was no meaningful Dutch side or French side, no division that made any practical sense. Just survivors. Just humans helping humans. Dutch and French military forces arrived together on relief flights, coordinating rescue operations seamlessly. Aid came from both governments simultaneously, distributed based on need rather than nationality. Locals rebuilt side by side, sharing tools and resources without regard for which administrative zone they technically lived in. The artificial division that had existed for 369 years collapsed instantly under the weight of shared catastrophe, revealing itself as the legal fiction it had always been. And something remarkable happened in the aftermath, something that could have gone very differently. Instead of using the disaster as an opportunity to consolidate control, redraw boundaries for efficiency, or assert dominance, both governments doubled down on cooperation in ways that strengthened the partnership. Joint rebuilding efforts with shared funding. Coordinated infrastructure projects that benefited both sides. Unified disaster response protocols for future hurricanes. The island that had been legally divided for nearly 4 centuries became functionally more unified through destruction than it ever had been through diplomacy or economics. Irma revealed a fundamental truth that had always been there but was easy to ignore during peaceful prosperity. The border was always primarily a legal fiction, an administrative convenience that had little correspondence to lived reality. The real island was always one place, one interconnected community, one shared ecosystem, with 2 different postal systems and tax codes. Today, the border is almost completely invisible unless you actively looking for it or checking your cell phone bill. There's still a monument at Oyster Pond, a white obelisk marking the original treaty point where Dutch and French representatives supposedly met. There are small, understated signs on major roads where pavement crosses the line. Bienvenue à Saint Martin, in elegant French script. Welcome to Saint Martin in straightforward Dutch style. But no checkpoints whatsoever. No customs inspections. No border guards checking documents. No security infrastructure. The only reliable way you know you've crossed from one country to another is subtle. The language on street signs changes from French to Dutch or English. The architectural style shifts slightly from French. Colonial pastel colors to Dutch colonial earth tones, and your mobile phone might ping as it switches cell networks, potentially triggering expensive roaming charges if you're not careful. Economically, the 2 sides have diverged significantly over decades of different policies. The Dutch side officially uses the Netherlands Antillean guilder, though it's pegged to the US dollar and both currencies circulate freely. The French side uses the euro, making it technically part of the European Monetary Union. The Dutch side maintains much lower taxes, deliberately attracting cruise ships and mega-resort development. The French side enforces stricter development rules, environmental protections, and labor laws, preserving more natural coastline and maintaining a different aesthetic. But socially, culturally, in the ways that actually matter to daily life, the island remains deeply integrated in ways that transcend legal boundaries. Most locals speak at least 3 or 4 languages fluently. English is the common tongue, French and Dutch for official business, and often Papiamento or Spanish for community and commerce. Families routinely live on one side of the border and work on the other, commuting across an international boundary as casually as crossing a city street. Children attend schools based on language preference or quality, rather than which side of the invisible line their house sits on. The supermarket you choose to shop at on any given day depends primarily on currency exchange rates and weekly specials, not national loyalty or legal residence. This is what makes Saint Martin genuinely unique in the modern world of hardening borders and rising nationalism. It's not that the border doesn't exist legally. It absolutely does, with real legal and administrative consequences. It's that the people who actually live here collectively decided long ago that it doesn't matter enough to structure their entire lives around it. So why does this arrangement work here when borders everywhere else create conflict, violence, and suffering? When walls rise and families are separated? 3 fundamental reasons explain Sint Maarten's exceptionalism. First, scale and geography make separation genuinely impractical rather than merely inconvenient. The island is so physically small that true separation would be absurdly inefficient. You can't build meaningful walls or establish separate infrastructure systems when you share the same underground aquifer, face the same hurricane exposure season after season, depend on the same tourist economy, and have only one international airport that both sides need. Second, the border predates modern nationalism and all its pathologies. It was drawn in 1648, before France and the Netherlands became nation-states in the modern sense, before the invention of passports and border controls, before the 20th century idea that borders must be defended at all costs against infiltration. The Treaty of Concordia was fundamentally a practical business arrangement between 2 commercial enterprises, not a nationalistic claim about ethnic identity or cultural superiority. And third, perhaps most importantly, neither side ever wanted full control badly enough to fight seriously for it. The island was never strategically critical to either empire's core interests, never resource-rich enough to justify warfare, never populous enough to mobilize genuine nationalist movements demanding unification or independence. It was always just valuable enough to be worth sharing peacefully and simultaneously too small to dominate without unreasonable cost. This accidental pragmatism, this unintentional reasonableness born from geographic and economic constraints, creates something genuinely rare in human history. A border that exists completely legally but not psychologically. A division that's absolutely real on paper with genuine legal consequences and yet meaningless in daily practice. It's the precise opposite of most modern borders, which are often meaningless on paper. Arbitrary lines drawn by colonial powers with no regard for ethnic or cultural reality, but viciously, violently real in practice, defended with walls and guns and endless suffering. Sint Maarten proves something that nationalist politicians everywhere hate to admit. Borders are choices, not inevitabilities. They're human constructions that we collectively maintain through constant effort and violence, or that we collectively ignore when it serves us better. The island also reveals something about what cooperation requires. It's not primarily about good intentions or enlightened leadership, though those help. It's about structure and incentives. Sint Maarten's border works because fighting over it has always been more expensive than sharing it, because geography makes separation impractical, and because neither side's core interests are threatened by the other's presence. When those conditions exist, when the incentive structure favors cooperation, even colonizing empires can share peacefully. When they don't exist, even longtime neighbors can descend into violence. The modern challenges facing Sint Maarten have nothing to do with the border and everything to do with shared vulnerabilities. Climate change threatens both sides equally, with rising seas eroding beaches and stronger hurricanes devastating infrastructure. Tourism, which sustains the entire economy, strains water resources, sewage systems, and transportation networks. Economic inequality persists, with wealth concentrated in tourist zones while locals struggle with rising costs. These problems don't respect the border. They can't be solved by either side alone. They require exactly the kind of cooperation that the Treaty of Concordia established 376 years ago. Stand on that monument at Oyster Pond today, where the original treaty was supposedly signed, and look around carefully at what actually exists. On one side, a French flag snapping in the Caribbean wind, the tricolor of a republic that once ruled half of Europe. On the other side, Dutch colors representing a small nation that once dominated global trade. Between them, an island that belongs completely to both and truly to neither, that transcends both while remaining legally bound to both. The Caribbean Sea that surrounds this 37-square-mile rock doesn't care about treaties or flags. Hurricane winds don't respect territorial boundaries or administrative zones. The ocean that has been eroding coastlines and reshaping geography for millions of years will continue long after every government and empire has fallen. Empires rise with grand ambitions and fall into forgotten dust. Borders shift like sand, languages evolve and die. but the island remains solid volcanic rock beneath the political theater. Sint Maarten exists as a functional, unified place because two colonial powers, facing practical constraints, realized that sharing was infinitely cheaper than fighting, because geography made division impractical and cooperation necessary. Because the people who actually live here, generation after generation, decided that identity doesn't require exclusion, that you can be French or Dutch legally while being Caribbean culturally, that multiple loyalties can coexist without contradiction. It's not a perfect place, not some utopian ideal where all problems have been solved. Climate change threatens its beautiful beaches with inexorable physics. Tourism strains infrastructure beyond original design. Economic inequality persists despite overall prosperity. Political corruption occasionally surfaces. Drug trafficking uses the island as a transshipment point precisely because of its weak border controls. But the border itself? That border that should theoretically divide this island into competing factions, hostile neighbors, incompatible legal systems? That border is just a line on a map that locals cross a dozen times a day, every single day without thinking about it, without fear, without paperwork. Maybe that's the real lesson of Sint Maarten for our divided world. Not that borders don't matter at all. They clearly do in legal and administrative terms.